My fiance's brother gave a presentation called Marrying Within Your League at our gathering. And during his speech about women finding men of their status, he made several hints directed at me that only we understood. My name is Kevin, and I'm 28 years old. I work in web development, mostly freelance projects that keep me busy but allow me to work from home. I live what most people would describe as a pretty low-key life, and honestly, I prefer it that way. I'm the kind of person who thrives on routine and finds comfort in predictability. My typical day starts early with making coffee and checking emails before settling into my home office to work on client websites. I genuinely enjoy the quiet and calm that comes with this lifestyle. I'm not the life of the party, and I'm completely fine with that reality. It suits my personality perfectly. My wife, Maya, however, is the complete opposite of me in almost every way. She's incredibly outgoing and loud in the most wonderful, fun way imaginable. She's always planning something exciting or hosting people at our place. Maya comes from this massive extended family that seems to find any excuse to celebrate together. They're constantly organizing gatherings for birthdays, baby showers, anniversaries, job promotions, new car purchases. Honestly, they'll throw a party for absolutely anything you can think of. When Maya's family decides to celebrate something, they don't mess around. You're not just showing up to someone's house for pizza and beer like you might expect. Instead, you're arriving at a rented venue with a professionally catered buffet and a carefully curated playlist, almost like you're attending a wedding. The scale and attention to detail they put into these events is genuinely impressive. Maya and I have been married for 2 years now, and we dated for 3 years before that, which means I've attended quite a lot of these elaborate family gatherings over time. While most of her relatives are genuinely fine people who I enjoy spending time with, there's one person I've never managed to get along with, no matter how hard I've tried. That person is her cousin Derek. Derek works in construction doing heavy labor, and he absolutely will not let anyone forget this fact about himself. He has this habit of walking into every room like he owns the place, radiating an energy that demands immediate attention. If you don't match his intensity level, he interprets that as a sign of weakness, which creates an uncomfortable dynamic right from the start. I still remember the very first time I met Derek like it was yesterday. He asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I worked in web development, he actually laughed out loud. His response was dismissive and condescending. "So you stare at code on a computer all day?" That comment was just the beginning of what would become a long pattern of behavior. Over the years that followed, Derek kept making these little snide comments whenever we were around each other. The remarks were always delivered with perfect timing to maximize their impact. At one family cookout, he made a point of telling Maya within my earshot, "You're lucky you got a guy who organizes the kitchen instead of fixing the garage." The implication was crystal clear, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. During another gathering, I think it was a holiday dinner, Derek leaned over toward me with that familiar smirk on his face. He asked me if I knew how to use a power drill, then added with mock concern, "Or do you have to Google that too?" Each comment felt like a small test, designed to see how I would react in front of everyone else. What made these interactions particularly frustrating wasn't just the content of what Derek said, but the deliberate way he delivered each comment. There was always that self-satisfied smirk playing across his face, and every remark felt like he was testing me in front of the entire family. He seemed to be waiting for me to lose my temper or snap back at him, giving him the reaction he was clearly fishing for. I made a conscious decision never to rise to his bait, thinking that maintaining my composure was the mature approach. However, my refusal to engage seemed to annoy Derek even more than if I had argued with him. I wasn't giving him the confrontation he wanted, the dramatic response that would validate his behavior. Instead of backing off, this only seemed to encourage him to push harder. As time went on, Derek's comments became increasingly pointed and personal. It was clear that my calm responses weren't deterring him. If anything, they were making him more determined to get under my skin. The pattern was escalating, and I could sense that something bigger was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Everything finally boiled over at Maya's uncle's 55th birthday party, an event that will forever be burned into my memory. The celebration was held in this massive rented hall that could easily accommodate large crowds. More than 75 people showed up for the festivities, and everyone had dressed up for the occasion. The venue was decorated beautifully with a huge birthday cake as the centerpiece, And there was even a slideshow of old family photos playing on screens around the room. A professional DJ was spinning classic hits that had multiple generations of the family singing along. It was the kind of party where you barely have a chance to sit down because there's always someone pulling you onto the dance floor or dragging you across the room to say hello to relatives you haven't seen in months. The energy was infectious, and despite my usual preference for quieter gatherings, I found myself genuinely enjoying the celebration. Derek was already operating in high gear from the moment he walked through the door. He was shaking hands with an unnecessarily firm grip, shouting people's names across the crowded room, and slapping guys on the back like we were all in some kind of locker room together. At one point during the evening, I watched him greet someone by literally picking them up off the floor in an overly dramatic display of affection. Derek has always been someone who likes to perform for an audience, and this party gave him the perfect stage. Later in the evening, someone handed Derek a microphone for what Maya had told me was a volunteer speech he'd offered to give. This was classic Derek behavior, always ready to be the center of attention. I was sitting near the front of the room with Maya and her parents, and we were just finishing our dessert when Derek began addressing the crowd. At first, everything seemed completely normal and appropriate. Derek shared some heartwarming stories about growing up in the family, referencing old photographs and funny memories that had everyone smiling. He told this hilarious story about how Maya's uncle had once tried to deep fry a turkey for Thanksgiving and nearly set an entire shed on fire in the process. People were laughing and enjoying the nostalgic trip down memory lane. The atmosphere was light and celebratory, exactly what you'd expect from a birthday toast. Then, something shifted dramatically in Derek's tone and delivery. He started talking about how different men are these days compared to previous generations. He claimed that too many guys today don't know how to use their hands anymore, spending more time on their little laptops than actually doing anything useful with their lives. Derek began pontificating about how real men should be the kind who lead their families and communities, who build things with their own hands, and who don't get bossed around by anyone. As Derek delivered every single one of these pointed observations about modern masculinity, his eyes were locked directly on me. Each sentence felt like it was being delivered as a personal challenge, and the intent behind his words became impossible to ignore. He continued with statements like, "Real men don't need permission to speak," and "Real men aren't afraid to take charge," and perhaps most pointedly, "Real men don't sit back while someone else wears the pants." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically as people began to realize what was actually happening. You could hear the air conditioning buzzing in the background because the crowd had gone completely silent. I remained perfectly still in my chair, keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap, refusing to give Derek the reaction he was so obviously fishing for. Maya leaned toward me and whispered urgently, "What is he doing?" Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing anger. I could feel the tension radiating from her, but I stayed focused on maintaining my composure. Around us, other family members were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, and some people had started looking down at their plates as if they could somehow avoid being part of this awkward moment. I noticed several relatives glancing in our direction, trying to gauge how we were reacting to Derek's increasingly personal attack. One of Maya's uncles actually mouthed, "What the hell?" to someone sitting across his table, his face showing clear disapproval of what Derek was doing to what should have been a celebratory occasion. Derek concluded his speech by declaring, "And that's what makes a real man, not someone who lets his woman call the shots." As he delivered this final insult, he stared directly at me while gripping the microphone with both hands, holding the moment like he was waiting for enthusiastic applause that never came. The clapping that followed was painfully awkward and scattered. A few people offered some polite smiles, but you could tell that most of the room was deeply uncomfortable with what had just transpired. Maya's father looked like he was ready to break something. His jaw clenched tightly as he processed what Derek had just done to his daughter's husband in front of the entire extended family. Maya didn't say anything immediately, but I could see her jaw was clenched with barely contained fury. Under the table, her grip on my hand had become so tight it was almost painful, reflecting the intensity of her anger at Derek's public humiliation attempt. My fiancé's brother gave a presentation called Marrying Within Your League at our gathering, and during his speech about women finding men of their status, he made several hints directed at me that only we understood. My name is Kevin, and I'm 28 years old. I work in web development, mostly freelance projects that keep me busy but allow me to work from home. I live what most people would describe as a pretty low-key life, and honestly, I prefer it that way. I'm the kind of person who thrives on routine and finds comfort in predictability. My typical day starts early with making coffee and checking emails before settling into my home office to work on client websites. I genuinely enjoy the quiet and calm that comes with this lifestyle. I'm not the life of the party, and I'm completely fine with that reality. It suits my personality perfectly. My wife, Maya, however, is the complete opposite of me in almost every way. She's incredibly outgoing and loud in the most wonderful, fun way imaginable. She's always planning something exciting or hosting people at our place. Maya comes from this massive extended family that seems to find any excuse to celebrate together. They're constantly organizing gatherings for birthdays, baby showers, anniversaries, job promotions, new car purchases. Honestly, they'll throw a party for absolutely anything you can think of. When Maya's family decides to celebrate something, they don't mess around. You're not just showing up to someone's house for pizza and beer like you might expect. Instead, you're arriving at a rented venue with a professionally catered buffet and a carefully curated playlist, almost like you're attending a wedding. The scale and attention to detail they put into these events is genuinely impressive. Maya and I have been married for 2 years now, and we dated for 3 years before that, which means I've attended quite a lot of these elaborate family gatherings over time. While most of her relatives are genuinely fine people who I enjoy spending time with, there's one person I've never managed to get along with, no matter how hard I've tried. That person is her cousin Derek. Derek works in construction doing heavy labor, and he absolutely will not let anyone forget this fact about himself. He has this habit of walking into every room like he owns the place, radiating an energy that demands immediate attention. If you don't match his intensity level, he interprets that as a sign of weakness, which creates an uncomfortable dynamic right from the start. I still remember the very first time I met Derek like it was yesterday. He asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I worked in web development, he actually laughed out loud. His response was dismissive and condescending. "So you stare at code on a computer all day?" That comment was just the beginning of what would become a long pattern of behavior. Over the years that followed, Derek kept making these little snide comments whenever we were around each other. The remarks were always delivered with perfect timing to maximize their impact. At one family cookout, he made a point of telling Maya within my earshot, "You're lucky you got a guy who organizes the kitchen instead of fixing the garage." The implication was crystal clear, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. During another gathering, I think it was a holiday dinner, Derek leaned over toward me with that familiar smirk on his face. He asked me if I knew how to use a power drill, then added with mock concern, "Or do you have to Google that too?" Each comment felt like a small test, designed to see how I would react in front of everyone else. What made these interactions particularly frustrating wasn't just the content of what Derek said, but the deliberate way he delivered each comment. There was always that self-satisfied smirk playing across his face, and every remark felt like he was testing me in front of the entire family. He seemed to be waiting for me to lose my temper or snap back at him, giving him the reaction he was clearly fishing for. I made a conscious decision never to rise to his bait, thinking that maintaining my composure was the mature approach. However, my refusal to engage seemed to annoy Derek even more than if I had argued with him. I wasn't giving him the confrontation he wanted, the dramatic response that would validate his behavior. Instead of backing off, this only seemed to encourage him to push harder. As time went on, Derek's comments became increasingly pointed and personal. It was clear that my calm responses weren't deterring him. If anything, they were making him more determined to get under my skin. The pattern was escalating, and I could sense that something bigger was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Everything finally boiled over at Maya's uncle's 55th birthday party, an event that will forever be burned into my memory. The celebration was held in this massive rented hall that could easily accommodate large crowds. More than 75 people showed up for the festivities, and everyone had dressed up for the occasion. The venue was decorated beautifully with a huge birthday cake as the centerpiece, and there was even a slideshow of old family photos playing on screens around the room. A professional DJ was spinning classic hits that had multiple generations of the family singing along. It was the kind of party where you barely have a chance to sit down because there's always someone pulling you onto the dance floor or dragging you across the room to say hello to relatives you haven't seen in months. The energy was infectious, And despite my usual preference for quieter gatherings, I found myself genuinely enjoying the celebration. Derek was already operating in high gear from the moment he walked through the door. He was shaking hands with an unnecessarily firm grip, shouting people's names across the crowded room, and slapping guys on the back like we were all in some kind of locker room together. At one point during the evening, I watched him greet someone by literally picking them up off the floor in an overly dramatic display of affection. Derek has always been someone who likes to perform for an audience, and this party gave him the perfect stage. Later in the evening, someone handed Derek a microphone for what Maya had told me was a volunteer speech he'd offered to give. This was classic Derek behavior, always ready to be the center of attention. I was sitting near the front of the room with Maya and her parents, and we were just finishing our dessert when Derek began addressing the crowd. At first, everything seemed completely normal and appropriate. Derek shared some heartwarming stories about growing up in the family, referencing old photographs and funny memories that had everyone smiling. He told this hilarious story about how Maya's uncle had once tried to deep fry a turkey for Thanksgiving and nearly set an entire shed on fire in the process. People were laughing and enjoying the nostalgic trip down memory lane. The atmosphere was light and celebratory, exactly what you'd expect from a birthday toast. Then, something shifted dramatically in Derek's tone and delivery. He started talking about how different men are these days compared to previous generations. He claimed that too many guys today don't know how to use their hands anymore, spending more time on their little laptops than actually doing anything useful with their lives. Derek began pontificating about how real men should be the kind who lead their families and communities, who build things with their own hands, and who don't get bossed around by anyone. As Derek delivered every single one of these pointed observations about modern masculinity, his eyes were locked directly on me. Each sentence felt like it was being delivered as a personal challenge, and the intent behind his words became impossible to ignore. He continued with statements like, "Real men don't need permission to speak," and "Real men aren't afraid to take charge," and perhaps most pointedly, "Real men don't sit back while someone else wears the pants." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically as people began to realize what was actually happening. You could hear the air conditioning buzzing in the background because the crowd had gone completely silent. I remained perfectly still in my chair, keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap, refusing to give Derek the reaction he was so obviously fishing for. Maya leaned toward me and whispered urgently, "What is he doing?" Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and growing anger. I could feel the tension radiating from her, but I stayed focused on maintaining my composure. Around us, other family members were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, and some people had started looking down at their plates as if they could somehow avoid being part of this awkward moment. I noticed several relatives glancing in our direction, trying to gauge how we were reacting to Derek's increasingly personal attack. One of Maya's uncles actually mouthed, "What the hell?" to someone sitting across his table, his face showing clear disapproval of what Derek was doing to what should have been a celebratory occasion. Derek concluded his speech by declaring, "And that's what makes a real man, not someone who lets his woman call the shots." As he delivered this final insult, he stared directly at me while gripping the microphone with both hands, holding the moment like he was waiting for enthusiastic applause that never came. The clapping that followed was painfully awkward and scattered. A few people offered some polite smiles, but you could tell that most of the room was deeply uncomfortable with what had just transpired. Maya's father looked like he was ready to break something. His jaw clenched tightly as he processed what Derek had just done to his daughter's husband in front of the entire extended family. Maya didn't say anything immediately, but I could see her jaw was clenched with barely contained fury. Under the table, her grip on my hand had become so tight it was almost painful, reflecting the intensity of her anger at Derek's public humiliation attempt. I made a conscious decision not to react, and it wasn't because I wasn't angry. I absolutely was furious. However, standing up in front of 75 people and turning this into an even bigger scene wasn't going to help the situation or accomplish anything positive. If I had spoken up in that moment, I might have said something I couldn't take back later, and I chose to take the high road instead. After Derek's speech ended, the party technically continued, but the entire mood had fundamentally changed. The celebratory atmosphere that had filled the room just minutes earlier felt forced and strained. Later in the evening, I walked toward the buffet table simply to get a soda, and I heard someone whisper something behind me. When I turned around to see who it was, two people immediately looked away as if they hadn't been saying anything at all. As I made my way through the venue, I passed a group of Maya's younger cousins who had been chatting animatedly just moments before. The instant I walked by their table, they all went completely quiet, creating an uncomfortable silence that hung in the air. Nobody said anything directly to my face about what had happened, but the entire social dynamic of the room had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. We stayed at the party for another hour, mostly out of politeness and respect for Maya's uncle, whose birthday celebration had been hijacked by Derek's personal agenda. Maya managed to have conversations with a few relatives during this time, while I mostly kept to myself, not wanting to create any additional awkwardness for people who were already struggling with how to handle the situation. The music eventually got louder and people started dancing again, making an obvious effort to return to the festive mood. However, the underlying tension from Derek's speech was still there, lurking beneath the surface of every interaction. As I walked past different groups of people throughout the remainder of the evening, many avoided making eye contact with me entirely. A few relatives offered polite nods when our paths crossed, but nobody really engaged in actual conversation with me for the rest of the night. When we finally got in the car to drive home afterward, neither Maya nor I said anything for the first several minutes of the journey. Maya just stared out the passenger window in what appeared to be stunned silence, processing everything that had just happened. I drove us home without any music playing, both of us lost in our own thoughts about the evening's events. Whatever had just transpired at that birthday party, we both understood instinctively that it wasn't something that was going to blow over or be forgotten easily. Derek had crossed a line in front of the entire extended family, and there would inevitably be consequences and fallout from his actions. The morning after the party, I discovered that Maya was already fully dressed and pacing around our bedroom by the time I got out of the shower. She had her phone clutched tightly in her hand, and her jaw was set in that determined way that told me she was barely containing her anger about the previous night's events. I could see she was halfway through typing what was probably a very strongly worded message to someone. I asked her to wait before reaching out to anyone, especially Derek, because we hadn't even discussed between ourselves how we wanted to handle the situation. Maya nodded in agreement, but her entire body language showed she was tense and coiled, like she was holding in a scream of frustration. We sat down at our kitchen table and methodically went over everything that had happened the night before. We didn't overthink it or analyze every possible interpretation. We just focused on the basic facts of what Derek had said and done in front of everyone. We wanted to make sure we both had the same clear understanding of the events before deciding how to move forward. While we were still discussing the situation, Maya's phone suddenly rang. It was her father calling, and he immediately launched into an apology for what had happened at the party. He told us he was genuinely embarrassed and frustrated by Derek's behavior, explaining that he had no idea Derek would twist what was supposed to be a celebratory birthday speech into such a personal attack against me. You could hear the disappointment and anger in his voice as he spoke. Maya's father said he was planning to talk to Derek himself about what had happened, but we asked him to hold off on that conversation until we had figured out exactly how we wanted to handle the entire situation. We needed time to process and decide on our approach before involving other family members in potential confrontations. Later that same day, I received a message from Derek through one of the social media apps we were both on. The message was brief and infuriating. "No hard feelings, bro. Just saying what needed to be said." There was no apology anywhere in the message, no acknowledgement that he had done anything wrong, and certainly no explanation for his behavior. Instead, it was pure smugness. Like he genuinely believed I was simply too sensitive to handle what he considered to be the truth. I decided to respond by asking him directly what exactly needed to be said at a family birthday celebration. I wanted to give him an opportunity to explain himself or at least acknowledge how inappropriate his speech had been. The message showed as read almost immediately, but Derek never bothered to respond to my question. His silence spoke volumes about his intentions and his complete lack of accountability. That non-response was the final straw for me. Derek's refusal to even attempt an explanation confirmed beyond any doubt that he had delivered that speech entirely on purpose, with full knowledge of how hurtful and inappropriate it was. More importantly, it showed that he had no intention of taking any responsibility for his actions or the damage he had caused. Maya decided to reach out to Derek's mother, thinking that perhaps someone older and more respected in the family could talk some sense into him about his behavior. Unfortunately, instead of receiving support or understanding, Maya got completely brushed off. Derek's mother told her dismissively that Derek's speech was just a joke, and that I needed to develop thicker skin if I wanted to be part of the family. According to Derek's mother, this kind of behavior was simply how Derek had always been, and everyone in the family had learned to deal with his personality over the years. She made it sound like accommodating Derek's cruelty was just a normal part of family dynamics that we should accept without complaint. The next 2 days brought a steady stream of vague, unhelpful text messages from various relatives. None of them addressed the situation directly or offered any meaningful support. Instead, we received messages like, "Don't take it so personally," and "That's just how Derek is," as if his behavior was some unchangeable force of nature that we should simply accept. One person even sent us a message saying, "Derek just has a strong personality, but he means well," completely missing the point of what had actually happened. It became crystal clear that no one in the family wanted to confront Derek directly about his inappropriate behavior. They all preferred to minimize the situation and pressure us to just let it slide rather than hold Derek accountable for his actions. The pattern of enabling his behavior had apparently been going on for years. Fortunately, one of my friends who had actually been present at the party reached out to offer his perspective on what he had witnessed. He confirmed what I already knew, but desperately needed to hear from someone else. Derek's speech wasn't some general philosophical statement about masculinity or modern society. It was a carefully crafted, targeted attack designed specifically to humiliate me in front of the entire extended family. My friend described it as one of the most passive-aggressive displays he had ever witnessed in a public setting. Then, Maya's younger cousin sent us something that made the entire situation much clearer and provided crucial evidence of what had actually transpired. She had recorded Derek's entire speech on her phone and wanted to make sure there was an accurate record of what happened, in case anyone later tried to deny or downplay the severity of his words and actions. When we watched the video footage that evening, Derek's malicious intent became even more obvious than it had been in person. In the recording, you could clearly see that Derek wasn't just speaking to the room in general. He was looking directly at me for nearly the entire duration of his speech. Every calculated pause, every self-satisfied smirk, and every carefully chosen phrase was aimed straight at me with unmistakable precision. We decided to show the video to Maya's parents that same evening, wanting them to see the undeniable evidence of what Derek had done. Her father sat stiffly in his chair, watching the footage without saying a single word until it ended completely. When the video finished, he simply stood up without comment and walked out to the backyard, clearly needing space to process what he had just witnessed. Maya's mother didn't speak for quite a while after viewing the recording either. She just kept shaking her head in what appeared to be disbelief, finally saying that she didn't recognize this version of Derek and couldn't understand how he had thought such behavior was acceptable at a family celebration. A few hours later, Derek posted something on his Facebook page that made his complete lack of remorse abundantly clear. The post read, "Soft men can't handle honesty. If the shoe fits." He didn't tag anyone in the post because he didn't need to. Everyone in the family knew exactly what had happened at the birthday party and understood who his message was targeting. Maya decided to leave a comment directly under Derek's Facebook post, asking him point blank if he was talking about me, in his thinly veiled message about soft men. Within just a few minutes of her posting the comment, it had completely disappeared from the thread. Derek hadn't bothered to respond to her direct question. He had simply deleted her comment entirely, refusing to publicly acknowledge what everyone already knew to be true. That moment of cowardly deletion was when I decided I was completely done playing along with Derek's games. I went through every social media platform I could think of and blocked Derek on all of them. I didn't just unfollow him or mute his content, I completely blocked him from being able to contact me or see my activity. However, I knew that determined harassers could always create burner accounts to get around blocks, so I remained vigilant. Sure enough, just a few hours later, a new message appeared in my inbox from what was obviously a fake account. The profile had no picture, just a completely blank username with no identifying information. The message contained only a few words. "Blocking me proves my point." Derek was apparently so obsessed with getting the last word that he had created an entirely new account just to continue his harassment. I didn't dignify this pathetic attempt at continued contact with any kind of response. Instead, I immediately reported the obviously fake account to the platform and then blocked that one as well. I wasn't going to engage with Derek's desperate attempts to force a reaction from me. That night, I told Maya that I was completely finished with trying to engage with Derek in any capacity. There was no possible version of this situation that would end with us pretending the birthday speech had never happened or laughing it off like it was some weird misunderstanding between family members. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the way things were before. Maya agreed with my decision completely. She then reached out to her cousin Ava, who usually organizes most of the family events and gatherings. Maya told Ava directly that we would not be attending any future family functions if Derek was going to be invited. We were drawing a clear boundary and making it known to the family coordinator. When Ava asked what had happened to cause such a drastic decision, Maya told her to check with Derek directly if she wanted an explanation. If Derek wanted to tell his version of events, he was welcome to do so, but we weren't going to be part of the same social spaces as him anymore. We had made our choice and we were sticking to it. Ava didn't push back against our decision or try to convince us to reconsider. She simply said she understood our position and would keep us informed about family events that Derek wouldn't be attending. Her acceptance of our boundary without argument suggested that she might have had her own concerns about Derek's behavior. The next day, things went temporarily quiet. There were no more harassing messages, no additional passive-aggressive social media posts, and Derek seemed to have gone silent for the moment. However, both Maya and I knew instinctively that this wasn't the end of the situation. Derek wasn't the type of person to simply walk away from a conflict, especially when he thrived on attention and drama. Now that we had stopped giving him the reactions he craved, we had no idea what his next move might be. 2 days after we had told Ava that we wouldn't be attending any events where Derek was invited, she called Maya and attempted to mediate the situation. Ava suggested that maybe arranging a group call between all parties involved would help clear the air and resolve the conflict. She theorized that Derek might not have realized how his birthday speech had actually come across to everyone present, implying that the whole thing could have been some kind of misunderstanding. I immediately told Maya to shut down that suggestion completely. There was absolutely no misunderstanding about what had happened at that party. Derek had looked me directly in the eye for the entire duration of his speech while delivering his carefully crafted insults. He knew exactly what he was doing when he chose to humiliate me in front of 75 family members. Any attempt at mediation would just give him another platform to justify his behavior. The very next morning, Derek posted on his public Facebook page again, and this time he chose to communicate through a meme. He shared a photo showing a lion standing next to a tiny chihuahua with text overlay that read, "Some men handle things. Some men let their wives do the barking." The caption he added said something about how real men don't need backup when facing challenges, clearly another dig at our situation. People in the comments section were laughing and tagging each other, treating Derek's continued harassment like it was entertaining content. Not a single person called him out for his inappropriate behavior or suggested that maybe he should stop targeting a family member publicly. The lack of accountability from his social circle was both disappointing and revealing. That same day, Maya's uncle, the one whose 55th birthday celebration Derek had hijacked, called to give us an update on a conversation he'd had with Derek. Maya's uncle had spoken to Derek expecting to find at least some regret or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, Derek told him that he stood by every single word he had said during the speech. According to Derek, his birthday toast had been real talk, and I needed to hear those harsh truths about myself. Maya's uncle apologized to us again, expressing his genuine dismay that Derek would turn what was supposed to be a celebratory birthday toast into something so deeply personal and hurtful. He clearly felt responsible for what had happened at his own party, even though Derek's behavior wasn't his fault. Over the next several days, Maya began receiving a handful of quiet, private messages from various relatives. Some were short and simple, just saying, "I'm sorry," without elaborating further. Others were more revealing, with people admitting they weren't actually surprised by Derek's behavior at all. One relative confided that Derek had always been a bully, even when they were growing up together, and that the family had learned over the years to work around his aggressive personality rather than directly confronting him about it. Another family member privately admitted that she had been deliberately avoiding being in the same room with Derek unless absolutely necessary, because she found his behavior so consistently unpleasant. It became clear that Derek's pattern of targeting and bullying people wasn't new. It was just that nobody in the family wanted to deal with the fallout that would come from actually confronting him about it. Then, Maya's grandmother called, and this conversation was particularly difficult for both of us to process. She explained that the family didn't need any more division or conflict, suggesting that the entire situation was probably based on misunderstandings that had gotten blown out of proportion. Her solution was that we should all simply move past what had happened at the birthday party for the sake of maintaining family peace and harmony. Maya didn't argue with her grandmother during the phone call, showing respect for her elder status in the family. However, after the call ended, Maya didn't speak for a very long time. She just sat quietly, processing what her grandmother had asked of us. That particular conversation hurt more deeply than anything Derek had actually done to us, because it represented the people who had witnessed his behavior firsthand, and still asked us to pretend it didn't matter. This wasn't just about Derek's inappropriate speech anymore. It had become about all the people who saw what happened and still expected us to sweep it under the rug for the sake of avoiding uncomfortable family conversations. The pressure to ignore Derek's cruelty was coming from multiple directions now. After that phone call with her grandmother, the pressure from other family members started intensifying. Text messages from various relatives began trickling in with similar themes and requests. We received messages saying things like, "It's not worth fighting over. Just let it go," and the ever-popular, "You know how Derek is." The same pattern kept repeating itself over and over. Excuses for Derek's behavior dressed up as well-meaning advice for us. That night, Maya and I sat down together and carefully composed a message that we planned to send to the extended family. We didn't attack anyone or make accusations against people who had remained silent. Instead, we simply explained the facts of what had happened as clearly and objectively as possible. We outlined that Derek's speech hadn't been a harmless joke, that he had doubled down on his behavior instead of apologizing when confronted, and that we were drawing a firm boundary as a result. We made it clear in our message that we weren't asking anyone else in the family to take sides in this conflict. We just wanted people to understand why we had made the decision not to attend family events where Derek would be present. We felt that honest communication was better than letting rumors and misunderstandings spread throughout the family network. We sent this carefully crafted message to the extended family group chat and then waited to see how people would respond. For an entire day, absolutely no one said anything in reply. The silence in the group chat was deafening, suggesting that people either didn't know how to respond or were afraid to get involved in the situation. Finally, Derek's mother broke the silence by replying to our message. Her response was brief and dismissive. "That's just how Derek is. You're overreacting." She offered no acknowledgement of the validity of our concerns, no suggestion that Derek should modify his behavior, and no empathy for what we had experienced. After her comment, no one else in the family followed up with any additional responses. Maya and I looked at each other after reading Derek's mother's reply, and we both knew what we needed to do. Maya left the family group chat first, and I followed her lead by doing the same thing. We didn't make a dramatic announcement about our departure or send any final messages. We simply removed ourselves from the conversation entirely, choosing to step away rather than continue trying to reason with people who had already made up their minds. A few days later, one of Maya's friends sent her a link that revealed Derek's harassment campaign was expanding beyond family gatherings and social media posts. Derek had apparently uploaded a new podcast episode featuring himself and one of his co-workers as co-hosts. While he was careful not to use actual names in the episode, he didn't need to be more specific for people to understand exactly who he was targeting. The episode was titled, "Soft Men and the Women Who Enable Them," which made Derek's focus crystal clear. At several points during the podcast, Derek repeated lines from his birthday party speech, almost word for word. He talked about some men hiding behind laptops and some men getting led around like pets, using the exact same condescending tone and message that he had delivered in front of our entire extended family. I decided to clip the most relevant audio section from Derek's podcast episode and sent it to both Maya and her father. This wasn't about seeking sympathy or validation. It was about documenting the pattern of harassment that Derek was creating across multiple platforms and formats. After Maya's father listened to the audio clip, he called us immediately. He didn't yell or lose his temper during the phone conversation, but you could hear the controlled anger in his voice. He simply told us that he was going to handle the situation privately with Derek, presumably through a direct confrontation. Maya's father had clearly reached his limit with Derek's ongoing behavior and public attacks on his daughter's husband. That same evening, I went into my home office and opened a blank notebook to begin creating a comprehensive written record of everything that had happened. I documented Derek's speech at the birthday party, the burner account message, the Facebook posts, the family group chat interactions, and now the podcast episode. I wrote down every single incident with dates and as much detail as I could remember. I wasn't writing everything down because I wanted to dwell on the situation or because I was planning some kind of revenge. I was creating this record because people were already trying to rewrite what had actually happened, minimizing Derek's behavior and suggesting that we were overreacting to harmless family dynamics. I needed an accurate record of events in case the situation escalated further, or if Derek's version of events started spreading. After that documentation session, Maya and I made a conscious decision to keep to ourselves and avoid engaging with any more family drama. We stopped responding to calls about the situation, stopped posting anything on social media that could be misconstrued, and stopped sending messages trying to explain our position to relatives. However, despite our efforts to disengage, it didn't feel like the situation was actually over. Instead, it felt like Derek wasn't finished with his campaign against us yet. He seemed to have made me into a symbol for everything he hated about modern masculinity, and he didn't appear to know how to stop pushing against that target. Based on his escalating pattern of behavior, I had no idea what his next move would be, but I was determined to stop being surprised by his actions. The sense that this wasn't truly resolved hung over both Maya and me like a dark cloud, even as we tried to return to our normal daily routines and focus on our own lives rather than Derek's obsession with us. A few days after the podcast episode where Derek had mocked soft men, Maya's cousin reached out to her with some disturbing information she had obtained during a video call. She had been on a group video chat with Derek and two other relatives when Derek began bragging openly about why he had given that speech at the birthday party in the first place. According to Maya's cousin, Derek proudly explained that he had delivered the speech specifically to put me in my place because no one else in the family had the courage to do what needed to be done. He described his public humiliation of me as a wake-up call and actually joked that I should be thanking him for shaking things up and forcing some uncomfortable truths into the open. Maya's father followed through on what he had promised earlier and arranged to meet with Derek in person for a direct confrontation. There were no middlemen involved, no group chats or phone calls, just the two of them sitting down face-to-face to address Derek's behavior. Unfortunately, Derek didn't walk back his actions or show any remorse during this conversation either. Instead, Derek doubled down on everything he had been saying and doing. He told Maya's father that I was too soft to be an appropriate husband, that I wasn't the kind of man who leads a household effectively, and that Maya deserved someone more assertive and traditionally masculine. Derek's arrogance and complete lack of self-awareness were stunning, even by his own standards. The conversation between Maya's father and Derek ended when Maya's father warned him directly to stop escalating the situation or face the consequence of being completely cut off from family contact. Derek apparently found this threat amusing rather than concerning, laughing it off and claiming he wasn't scared of fake consequences from people who didn't have the backbone to follow through on their warnings. 2 days later, Derek released another podcast episode that made it clear he had no intention of backing down or moderating his behavior. He called this new episode Beta Energy in the Family. And while he still avoided using actual names, the details he included weren't even remotely subtle or disguised anymore. Derek described the birthday party setting in the new podcast episode, mentioning the size of the room and the number of people present. He talked about how someone had hidden behind his wife's glare instead of speaking up when confronted with hard truths. Derek called me a domesticated man pretending to be a provider, escalating his personal attacks to an even more vicious level than before. The situation took a concerning turn when a coworker of mine found Derek's podcast episode and brought it to my attention. I was in the middle of a virtual work meeting when this coworker casually asked if I had heard a podcast that sounded like it was specifically about me. He explained that someone had forwarded the episode to him as a joke, not knowing that I was the person being targeted in Derek's rant. That was the moment I realized Derek's harassment campaign had moved beyond family drama territory and was now potentially affecting my professional life. Derek was apparently trying to drag our conflict into my workplace by creating content that my colleagues might stumble across and connect back to me. Maya and I decided to file a formal report with the podcast platform hosting Derek's show. Our complaint focused on the fact that the episode included specific references to a private family event and contained targeted language that constituted harassment. We provided documentation showing the pattern of Derek's behavior and explained how he was using their platform to continue a personal vendetta. It took approximately 48 hours for the platform to review our complaint, but they ultimately removed the episode for violating their harassment policy. The takedown was a small victory, but we knew Derek wouldn't accept it quietly or gracefully. Sure enough, Derek didn't respond to the platform's action with any kind of reflection or restraint. Instead, he posted a long, angry message on his public social media account accusing me of censorship and attempting to silence him. While he was still careful not to use my actual name in the post, he tagged 2 mutual contacts we shared, making his target obvious to anyone paying attention. Derek's post read, "Imagine being so soft you have to cry to the internet to silence someone." The 2 people he tagged in this message were particularly concerning choices. One of them worked at a company that had hired me for freelance projects in the past, and the other was a college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Derek was clearly trying to drag my professional and personal networks into our conflict. That night, I made the decision to go through all my social media accounts systematically and block every single mutual connection I still shared with Derek. I didn't care how distant or insignificant the link might be. I wasn't going to allow Derek any potential pathway to slip additional harassment through to me or people in my network. The following weekend, we discovered that Derek had organized a family barbecue and had been quite open about excluding us from the event. While we weren't surprised that we hadn't been invited, what caught our attention was how deliberately public the exclusion had been made. Maya's younger brother was included in a group chat that Derek had created specifically for organizing the barbecue event. Someone had forwarded Maya's brother several screenshots from Derek's organizing group chat, and the content was even more vicious than we had expected. In one of the messages, Derek had called me deadweight and stated that Maya had married beneath her social and personal standards. No one in the group chat had pushed back against these cruel characterizations or defended us in any way. That same night, I decided it was time to call a lawyer and explore what legal options might be available to us. I explained the entire situation to the attorney, walking through Derek's speech at the birthday party, the burner account harassment, the social media posts, the podcast episodes, the messages to my professional contacts, and the broader impact all of this was having on my work life. The lawyer listened carefully to everything I described and told me to begin compiling all the evidence I had gathered into one comprehensive file. He explained that we needed to create a thorough record with dates, screenshots, audio clips, and detailed notes about each incident if we wanted to pursue any kind of legal action. From that point forward, Maya and I started creating a systematic documentation system for Derek's ongoing harassment campaign. We organized everything chronologically and made sure to preserve evidence in multiple formats and locations. Meanwhile, several of Maya's cousins began reaching out to her privately with messages of support. They told her that they agreed with our position and supported our decision to draw boundaries with Derek. However, they also admitted they were afraid of getting dragged into the conflict themselves if they spoke up publicly. Their fear was understandable but also frustrating, as it meant Derek continued to face no real consequences for his behavior within the family. One of Maya's cousins revealed something that provided important context for Derek's current behavior. She told us that Derek had turned on a different family member a few years ago, launching a similar campaign of harassment and public humiliation against them. According to her, it had taken almost a full year for things to settle down and return to any semblance of normalcy after Derek's previous targeting campaign. The cousins who were messaging Maya privately weren't surprised that Derek was doing this to us. They were just surprised that his harassment had become so public and obvious this time. This revelation made it clear that Derek's behavior wasn't an isolated incident or a reaction to something specific we had done. It was a pattern of targeting and bullying that he had used against other family members in the past. At this point, I stopped waiting for anyone else in the family to stand up and do the right thing. The pattern of enabling Derek's behavior was too well established, and too many people were too afraid of becoming his next target to risk confronting him directly. I decided to focus on my own mental health and booked a session with a therapist. I didn't seek therapy to talk exclusively about Derek or to process the family drama he had created. Instead, I wanted to start figuring out how to handle being under constant pressure from multiple directions. I needed strategies for dealing with the stress of people watching and whispering about our situation, quietly deciding whose side they were on without ever asking me what had actually happened. At some point during this entire ordeal, it became crystal clear that Derek's campaign against me wasn't really about the birthday party speech anymore. he had turned his harassment into something much larger and more systematic. Derek wasn't just trying to insult me or get under my skin. He was actively trying to convince other people that I didn't deserve respect, that I didn't belong in the family, and that I was some kind of temporary placeholder until Maya came to her senses. I realized that I didn't care about winning this conflict in any traditional sense. What I cared about was not letting Derek define who I was to everyone else in our social circles. I wasn't going to match his aggressive energy or respond to his provocations the way he clearly wanted me to. Instead, I just needed to protect my personal space, protect my work relationships, protect my marriage, and make it clear that whatever game Derek was playing, I wasn't going to participate. That realization meant drawing lines not with words or confrontations, but with concrete actions. From that point forward, every step I took was focused on making those boundaries stronger and more impenetrable. I wasn't going to engage with Derek's drama or try to reason with people who had already chosen to enable his behavior. The therapy sessions helped me recognize patterns and connections I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just Derek's constant attacks that had worn me down emotionally. It was the way so many other people let him continue his behavior without consequences. All the little shrugs, the deliberate looking the other way, and the endless excuses made on his behalf had created an environment where I felt like I was walking on eggshells constantly. I hadn't fully realized how often I had been modifying my own behavior, not just around Derek himself, but around everyone who acted like it wasn't their place to step in when they witnessed his cruelty. The therapy helped me understand that their silence was also a choice, and it was a choice that enabled Derek's continued harassment. Maya wanted to shift the energy in our house and reclaim some sense of normalcy, so she planned a small dinner party at our place. The guest list was deliberately limited to only the people who had quietly supported us throughout this entire ordeal. It wasn't a loud or flashy event, and there were no long speeches or dramatic statements about what we had been going through. Instead, it was simply an evening filled with good food, genuine laughter, and the company of people who didn't make excuses for cruelty or ask us to tolerate unacceptable behavior for the sake of family peace. It was the first time in weeks that our house actually felt like a true home again, rather than a place where we were constantly on edge waiting for the next attack. Around the same time, there was a family engagement party coming up for one of Maya's cousins. Maya's father told us he would be attending the celebration, and he had made plans to clear up a few misconceptions while he was there. He wasn't planning to make a scene or create drama at someone else's special event, but if certain relatives brought up Derek's speech or started asking questions about our absence from family gatherings, he was prepared to give them the unvarnished truth. Derek apparently caught wind of Maya's father's plans, because he started getting ahead of the situation by reaching out to relatives before the engagement party even took place. Family members began receiving calls and messages from Derek in which he presented a completely fabricated version of what had happened at the birthday celebration. In Derek's revisionist narrative, I had actually insulted him at the birthday party by making snide comments under my breath throughout the evening. According to his new story, Derek had only responded to my provocation in the moment, defending himself against attacks I had supposedly initiated. He was painting himself as the victim who had been forced to stand up for himself against my disrespectful behavior. Maya's mother confirmed that Derek's misinformation campaign was definitely happening when she spoke to two older relatives who had both been told completely different versions of the birthday party events. Derek was actively working to control the narrative and turn himself into the wronged party before anyone could hear our side of the story. Maya's father didn't waste time arguing with people or trying to counter Derek's lies with verbal explanations. Instead, he brought the video recording of Derek's speech to the engagement party on his phone. Throughout the evening, he discreetly showed the actual footage to several key relatives, letting Derek's own words and behavior speak for themselves. The reaction from family members who viewed the video was immediate and powerful. Several relatives looked genuinely stunned as they watched Derek's deliberate, targeted attack play out on the small screen. One uncle, who happened to be Derek's own godfather, was so disturbed by what he witnessed that he pulled Derek aside later in the evening. Derek's godfather told him directly that he needed to apologize to us immediately, or he would be distancing himself from future family events where Derek was present. Another cousin who saw the video was so disgusted by Derek's behavior that she walked away mid-conversation with him and refused to speak to him again for the rest of the night. The engagement party marked a turning point in how some family members viewed the situation. But Derek's response to this shift was predictably aggressive and self-serving. Derek's response came quickly and revealed just how unhinged he was becoming. The morning after the engagement party, he posted a TikTok video that was clearly designed to portray himself as the victim of some grand conspiracy. The video featured dark, moody lighting with dramatic background music, creating an atmosphere that was both pretentious and unsettling. The captions overlaid on Derek's TikTok video were filled with vague complaints about family betrayal and cowards who fear truth. While he didn't name anyone specifically in the video, the timing made it absolutely clear that he was responding to the previous night's events at the engagement party. Derek was apparently furious that people had seen the actual video evidence of his behavior. The caption Derek wrote for his TikTok post was loaded with pseudo-philosophical quotes about wolves and sheep, clearly positioning himself as the lone wolf surrounded by weak, sheep-like family members who couldn't handle his supposed honesty. The comment section was filled with complete strangers egging him on and validating his victim narrative, which only seemed to fuel his sense of righteousness. One of Maya's friends, who works in public relations, saw Derek's TikTok video and immediately flagged it as concerning behavior. She reached out to us and suggested that based on everything we had shown her about Derek's escalating pattern of harassment, it might be time to get ahead of the situation legally before it spiraled further out of control. Her professional opinion was that if Derek kept trying to turn our private family conflict into public content for his social media platforms, we needed to establish a documented trail of his behavior. She warned us that people like Derek often escalate their harassment campaigns when they feel like they're losing control of the narrative. That night, I sat down and created a comprehensive report documenting Derek's entire harassment campaign from beginning to end. I included the video footage of his birthday party speech, screenshots of all his social media posts targeting us, quotes and audio clips from his podcast episodes, copies of the anonymous messages sent through burner accounts, and detailed notes from people who had heard Derek's various versions of events. I sent this complete documentation package to the podcast platform's legal team, along with a formal complaint about ongoing harassment and Derek's use of private family footage for his public attacks against us. The report painted a clear picture of systematic harassment that had been escalating over time across multiple platforms and formats. Within just a few days of submitting our complaint, Derek's podcast show was flagged by the platform's content moderators. His co-host, someone who had barely spoken during the last several episodes and seemed increasingly uncomfortable with Derek's behavior, posted an update announcing that they were suspending all new uploads for the foreseeable future. After that announcement, Derek's podcast account went completely silent. No new episodes were uploaded, no updates were posted, and the entire project seemed to have been abandoned. It was clear that Derek's co-host had decided to distance himself from whatever Derek's podcast had turned into. That same week, an email arrived through my website's contact form that was obviously from Derek, though he hadn't used his real name or any identifying information. The message had no subject line and consisted of several paragraphs of angry, rambling text calling me weak and dishonest. The sender accused me of turning people against Derek through manipulation and lies. I immediately reported the anonymous email and flagged the IP address to my hosting service. I also permanently blocked all incoming communication from that specific address to prevent any future contact attempts. While there were no names attached to the message, the tone and content perfectly matched everything Derek had been doing across other platforms. Derek's fiancée, someone we had never really spoken to outside of brief interactions at family functions, reached out to Maya privately with a surprising message. She told Maya that she didn't want to be involved in the ongoing drama anymore, and that she was genuinely embarrassed by Derek's podcast content and how he had been handling the entire situation with our family. More significantly, Derek's fiancée revealed that she was stepping back from the podcast project entirely. She didn't want to be associated with what the show had turned into under Derek's influence. This was a clear indication that even people in Derek's inner circle were becoming uncomfortable with his escalating behavior and public harassment campaign. Her message gave us an idea for how to move forward constructively. We decided to host another small event at our house, but this time we limited the guest list exclusively to family members who had demonstrated through their actions that they understood the difference between honest communication and deliberate humiliation. This wasn't going to be an event with hidden cameras, manufactured drama, or indirect comments designed to create tension. Instead, we wanted to create a space for dinner, music, and genuine connection with people who could be in the same room together without feeling the need to tear someone else down for entertainment. The guest list for our family dinner was intentionally short, focusing on quality over quantity. Everyone who showed up brought something meaningful to contribute, whether it was food, flowers, or simply positive energy that enhanced the evening rather than detracting from it. Most importantly, no one asked about Derek during the entire event. No one brought up the podcast controversy, the birthday party speech, or any of the ongoing family conflict. There was genuine laughter in the kitchen as people cooked together, animated conversations around the dinner table, and later in the evening, people gathered around our fire pit for more relaxed discussion. Nobody was looking over their shoulder, waiting for someone to say something cruel or create unnecessary drama. That night, Maya and I didn't spend time discussing what our next steps should be in dealing with Derek's harassment. We didn't need to have that conversation because we had both reached the same conclusion independently. We weren't going to keep waiting for Derek to stop his campaign against us, and we weren't going to keep hoping that other family members would finally stand up to his behavior. Instead, we were simply choosing who got to be part of our lives going forward and making sure the door remained firmly shut for everyone else. We had learned that we couldn't control Derek's actions, but we could absolutely control our own responses and boundaries. The dinner we hosted turned out much better than we had expected, and the success wasn't due to any grand speeches or dramatic declarations of loyalty from our guests. It was simply about people showing up and making it clear through their presence alone where they stood on the issues that mattered to us. The evening demonstrated that support doesn't always require words. Sometimes it's communicated most effectively through consistent actions. No one felt the need to tiptoe around the topic of what had been happening with Derek, but no one allowed it to dominate or ruin the peaceful atmosphere we had created either. The entire evening felt calm and comfortable, serving as a powerful reminder that the loudest person in any room isn't necessarily the one who matters most or deserves the most attention. During the evening, one of Maya's older cousins shared something with us that we hadn't heard before, and it provided crucial insight into Derek's long-term pattern of behavior. She explained that Derek had always needed someone to target and bully, going back to his high school years when he would pick on kids who didn't fit into his narrow idea of how boys were supposed to act and behave. According to this cousin, when those high school classmates eventually pushed back against Derek's bullying or simply moved on with their lives, Derek would shift his focus to new targets. The pattern had been consistent throughout his life. Derek always needed someone to mock and belittle, not just for the attention it brought him, but because it made him feel in control and superior to others. Later in the evening, one of Maya's close friends pulled her aside and told her something that fundamentally changed how we were looking at the entire situation. This friend revealed that Derek had apparently been referring to me as a test-run husband behind closed doors, spreading the belief that Maya would eventually wise up and realize she needed someone stronger and more traditionally masculine. This revelation was deeply disturbing because it showed that Derek's harassment wasn't just about proving a point or expressing his opinions about masculinity. It demonstrated how deep his fixation on our relationship had become, and how obsessed he was with the idea of tearing me down and undermining our marriage. Derek wasn't content with just insulting me. He was actively working to convince people that our relationship was temporary and doomed. Maya decided to reach out directly to Derek's former fiancée, the same woman who had messaged her earlier about stepping back from the podcast project. Maya had a brief conversation with her, primarily to ask whether Derek had ever made personal comments about me during their relationship. The response from Derek's ex-fiancée was immediate and chilling in its brevity. "He talks about your husband a lot." She didn't offer any defense of Derek's behavior, didn't try to spin his comments as harmless, and didn't attempt to minimize the situation. Her straightforward answer confirmed our worst suspicions about how much mental energy Derek was devoting to his campaign against me. Maya showed me this message exchange, and neither of us needed to explain to the other why it mattered so much. The fact that Derek's own romantic partner had noticed his obsession with me was deeply concerning, and suggested that his harassment was consuming far more of his thoughts and energy than we had realized. That night, I called our lawyer again to provide him with an updated summary of Derek's escalating behavior. I included the new information about Derek's podcast being monetized, which meant he was potentially profiting from content that referenced our private family conflicts. I also mentioned that Derek's references to me in his content were becoming increasingly specific and personal over time. The lawyer told me to continue preserving every piece of evidence we could gather, emphasizing that we should keep everything: every post, every audio clip, every screenshot, and every witness statement. He explained that while Derek's behavior wasn't quite enough for immediate legal action, if Derek crossed certain additional lines, we would be thoroughly prepared to respond. A few days later, Maya's cousin hosted a baby shower for another family member, and Derek wasn't included on the guest list. Despite not being invited, Derek decided to show up anyway, apparently believing he could simply insert himself into the celebration without consequences. Derek showed up uninvited to the baby shower about halfway through the event, claiming he was simply there to congratulate family members on their happy news. When the host politely but firmly asked him to leave, Derek didn't create a violent scene, but he made sure his exit was dramatic and bitter enough to draw maximum attention. Derek slammed a chair into place with unnecessary force and tossed out a sarcastic comment on his way out the door, making sure everyone present knew that he had been pushed out of yet another family gathering. His performance was clearly designed to make himself look like the victim while creating an uncomfortable atmosphere for everyone else at the celebration. That same week, Derek began posting a series of vaguely religious quotes on his social media pages. The posts included phrases like, "A weak man leads his family to ruin," and "God gave men strength for a reason," continuing his campaign of targeted messaging without explicitly naming anyone. While Derek didn't tag specific people or mention names directly, the timing and content made his intended message unmistakably clear. A few people liked these religious posts, but most of Derek's social media connections ignored them entirely. However, several relatives told us privately that Derek's tone had crossed a line even for them, and they had decided to stop following his accounts altogether. His religious justifications for his behavior were apparently too much even for family members who had previously made excuses for him. Then, something particularly strange happened that revealed how far Derek was willing to go in his harassment campaign. A guy I hadn't spoken to since high school reached out to me completely out of the blue with a screenshot of a message he had received. Apparently, Derek had somehow tracked down this old acquaintance online and sent him an unsolicited message asking intrusive questions about my character. Derek's message to my former high school classmate asked whether I seemed like the kind of man who could protect a woman, and inquired if I had always been this type of person. The questions weren't subtle at all. Derek was clearly fishing for dirt on me, or trying to create the impression that damaging information about me existed, even if he couldn't find any actual evidence. My old classmate said the entire message felt creepy and inappropriate, so he decided to forward it to me rather than engage with Derek's obvious attempt at character assassination. This incident showed that Derek was now reaching into my distant past, trying to gather ammunition or manufacture evidence to support his narrative about my supposed inadequacies. Shortly after this incident, a lengthy post appeared on Derek's personal blog that revealed just how unhinged his thinking had become. The post was a full-page rant about being erased by his family and how he was experiencing betrayal from people who claimed to love him. Derek wrote extensively about false loyalty and complained that people were turning on him simply because they couldn't handle uncomfortable truths. The tone of Derek's blog post was scattered and incoherent, jumping between different themes without any logical connection. At one point, he compared himself to a soldier fighting a righteous battle. In another section, he claimed to be a voice for real men in what he called an increasingly soft world. Nothing in the entire rambling post tied together coherently, and the whole thing read like someone desperately trying to justify behavior that even they couldn't fully explain anymore. That blog post ended up being the final straw for several more family members who had been trying to remain neutral in the conflict. One of Maya's aunts reached out the day after the post went live to say she was completely done with Derek's behavior. She admitted that she had let things slide in the past because she didn't want to create family drama, but she now realized that her silence had only allowed Derek's harassment to continue unchecked. Maya's aunt also sent me a personal message which was brief but incredibly meaningful. Her note consisted of just one powerful sentence. "You've shown more grace than I would have in your shoes." That speaks louder than anything he said. Her acknowledgement of how I had handled Derek's harassment meant more to me than she probably realized. I went back to my documentation notebook and carefully added all of these new incidents to my comprehensive record. I wasn't keeping this detailed file because I wanted ammunition to use against Derek in some future confrontation, and I wasn't maintaining it because I was keeping score of our conflict. Instead, I needed to keep track of what was actually real, in case Derek ever tried to rewrite the narrative again, or convince people that his version of events was accurate. Derek had already demonstrated multiple times that he was willing to completely fabricate stories about what had happened between us. I had seen how effective his lies could be with family members who wanted to believe his explanations rather than face the uncomfortable truth about his behavior. Having a detailed, factual record felt essential for protecting the integrity of our experience. Derek wasn't someone I wanted to fix, change, or engage in battle with anymore. I had moved past any desire to prove myself to him or get the last word in our conflict. My focus had shifted entirely to making sure Derek couldn't control the story of what had happened or manipulate other people's perceptions of our situation. I had already witnessed how far Derek was willing to go with his harassment campaign, and I wasn't interested in waiting around to see what his next escalation might look like. Instead, I was staying prepared and keeping my peace completely out of his reach, no matter what tactics he tried next. Derek then disappeared from all public platforms for about 2 weeks, creating the longest period of silence since his original birthday party speech. There were no social media updates, no new posts appearing anywhere, no podcast clips floating around online, and no one in the family mentioned hearing from him. Nothing concerning Derek popped up in our inboxes or notification feeds during this time. The extended quiet period was both refreshing and slightly unnerving, because we had become accustomed to Derek's constant need for attention and drama. His sudden absence from all his usual platforms felt almost too good to be true, and both Maya and I found ourselves wondering if he was planning something bigger or simply regrouping for his next wave of attacks. Then, out of nowhere, Derek reappeared with the same aggressive voice and message, but under completely new branding. He had launched what was essentially a rebranded version of his podcast under a different title with a new logo design. However, the format, tone, and content were absolutely identical to his previous show that had been taken down for harassment violations. A listener who had been following Derek's situation from a distance recognized his distinctive speaking style and content approach despite the new branding. This person sent Maya a clip from Derek's new podcast episode, allowing us to confirm that Derek was simply trying to circumvent the previous platform restrictions by creating what appeared to be a completely different show. In the new podcast episode, Derek talked extensively about men under attack and how what he called real leadership was being characterized as toxic behavior by people who supposedly benefited from having weak men around them. While he continued to avoid using actual names, Derek described a family gathering filled with fake smiles and mentioned a husband who lets his wife run the show, making his target obviously clear. It was the exact same playbook Derek had been using all along, just with a different title and logo, to try to avoid the content restrictions that had been placed on his previous podcast. The substance, tone, and targeted nature of his harassment hadn't changed at all despite the superficial rebranding effort. I sent the audio clip from Derek's rebranded podcast to our lawyer, who confirmed that the rebrand was clearly an attempt to circumvent the previous takedown and continue his harassment campaign under a different name. Our attorney added this new evidence to our growing file, noting that Derek's pattern of behavior was now long enough, specific enough, and persistent enough that we had solid grounds to escalate the case legally if Derek continued his campaign. Right after Derek's new podcast episode dropped, his engagement to his fiancée ended very publicly. His now ex-fiancée posted a lengthy message on her social media about personal growth, learning to let go of toxic cycles, and moving forward independently on her own terms. The post was clearly a statement about her relationship with Derek, though she didn't mention him by name. Her post was deleted just an hour after it went live, but one of our relatives had managed to take a screenshot and passed it along to us. The timing of the post's deletion suggested that either Derek had pressured her to remove it, or she had decided the public nature of her statement wasn't worth the potential backlash she might receive. A few days later, Derek's now ex-fiancée reached out to Maya directly with a message that provided crucial insight into how Derek's obsession with me had affected his personal relationships. She didn't ask for anything from us or try to insert herself into our conflict with Derek. Instead, she simply wanted to explain why their engagement had ended and how it related to Derek's harassment campaign against me. According to Derek's ex-fiancée, their relationship had ended specifically because Derek had become completely obsessed with me and our family situation. She explained that Derek brought me up constantly in their private conversations, questioning Maya's judgment in marrying me, and spiraling into anger whenever she refused to agree with his assessments or declined to join in his criticism. Derek's ex-fiancée told Maya that she didn't recognize the man Derek had turned into during this conflict, and she wanted no part in the mess he kept creating and escalating. Her decision to end their engagement was directly related to Derek's inability to let go of his vendetta against me and move on with his own life. Maya forwarded this conversation to our lawyer, who said that having someone from Derek's inner circle confirm the extent of his obsession gave our case a completely new level of credibility. We now had testimony from someone who had witnessed Derek's harassment campaign from the inside, confirming that his behavior wasn't just public posturing, but had consumed his private life as well. 3 days after Derek's engagement ended, someone sent an email to my workplace using an anonymous address. The message was brief and contained a direct link to one of Derek's old podcast episodes, specifically the one that had already been removed from the platform for harassment violations. This was clearly an attempt to interfere with my professional life and damage my reputation with my employer. Fortunately, my boss had been briefed about Derek's harassment campaign months earlier, so he immediately recognized what the anonymous email represented. He flagged the message as targeted harassment and forwarded it to our company's HR department to be documented as an outside attempt to interfere with my employment. This incident marked a significant escalation because Derek's harassment was no longer confined to family conflicts or social media drama. It had become an active, deliberate effort to damage my career and professional relationships. The anonymous email represented a clear attempt at workplace harassment that went far beyond the boundaries of personal or family disputes. Around this same time, Derek's mother made an unexpected move by reviving a family group chat that had been inactive for several years. She added more than 20 relatives to this revived chat and invited everyone to attend a Sunday brunch that she positioned as an opportunity to clear the air and resolve the ongoing family tensions. Maya and I declined Derek's mother's invitation to the family brunch without hesitation. We didn't need a reset or an opportunity to hash things out in a group setting. What we needed was space and distance from Derek's ongoing harassment, and a brunch filled with people who had remained silent throughout his campaign wasn't going to provide the resolution or peace we were seeking. After the brunch took place, several of Maya's cousins filled us in on how the event had actually unfolded. Derek showed up late to the gathering, which was typical behavior for him when he wanted to make an entrance and draw attention to himself. According to the cousins who were present, Derek didn't offer any kind of apology for his behavior or acknowledge that he had done anything wrong. Instead, Derek became defensive when relatives asked him why he couldn't simply let the entire situation go and move on with his life. When someone directly challenged him to drop his real man narrative and stop targeting me publicly, Derek's response was to storm out of the brunch in a dramatic fashion, muttering something about people being too sensitive to handle the truth. Derek made sure his exit from the family brunch was as attention-grabbing as possible, ensuring that everyone present would remember his departure and feel the tension he was creating. His performance was designed to make him look like the victim of unreasonable family pressure rather than someone who had been asked to take responsibility for his own actions. The day after the unsuccessful family brunch, Derek posted a video on one of his newer social media accounts that revealed just how disconnected from reality he had become. The video was titled, "When You're Surrounded by Sheep, Be the Wolf," positioning himself as some kind of lone truth-teller surrounded by weak, easily manipulated family members. What made this video particularly problematic was that Derek had included edited footage from the family brunch in his social media content. The clips were shaky phone camera footage that had clearly been shot by someone else and then repurposed by Derek for his own narrative purposes. He had layered dramatic music over the footage to enhance the emotional impact and create a more compelling story. Derek hadn't asked anyone for permission to film at the family brunch, and he certainly hadn't obtained consent to use that private family footage in his public social media content. This represented a clear violation of everyone's privacy and showed that Derek was willing to exploit even intimate family gatherings for his ongoing harassment campaign. That unauthorized use of private family footage was the final straw for us. We immediately forwarded Derek's video to our lawyer, who sent a cease and desist letter within 24 hours. The legal document was formal, direct, and left no room for misinterpretation about what Derek needed to stop doing. The cease and desist letter warned Derek that his continued harassment could result in serious legal action being taken against him. It specifically cited his repeated harassment patterns, his creation of targeted content about our family, and his unauthorized use of private event footage for public attacks. The document made it clear that Derek needed to cease all further contact and stop creating any content that referenced us, directly or indirectly. The legal warning also established clear boundaries with no gray areas or loopholes that Derek could try to exploit. There would be no further contact between Derek and us, no indirect communication through third parties, and no more content creation that targeted our family in any way. Derek's response to receiving the cease and desist letter was to upload one final post on his personal blog, published in the middle of the night when he was probably hoping fewer people would notice it immediately. The post was a rambling rant about censorship, family betrayal, and being silenced by people who couldn't handle his version of the truth. Derek's final blog post went live in the middle of the night and was taken down less than 24 hours later, probably due to additional complaints or platform violations. In the post, Derek called himself the only person telling the truth in a situation where everyone else was living in denial. The content was bitter, defensive, and completely lacking in any self-reflection or accountability for his own actions. After that final blog post disappeared, everything went completely dark on Derek's end. His podcast vanished entirely from all platforms. His social media accounts were either deleted or deactivated, and his personal blog began showing only an error message when people tried to access it. No new content surfaced anywhere, no mentions of our situation appeared online, and no screenshots or clips were being circulated. For the first time in many months, the constant stream of notifications about Derek's latest attacks finally stopped completely. There were no more audio clips being forwarded to us by concerned friends, no more warnings from relatives about his newest posts, and no more being tagged in content we didn't want to see. The digital noise that had been surrounding our lives for so long suddenly went completely silent. The complete absence of Derek's online presence was both a relief and slightly unsettling, because we had grown accustomed to his constant need for attention and validation through attacking us. His sudden disappearance from all platforms felt almost too good to be true, leaving us wondering if this was actually the end or just another temporary pause before his next campaign. A full month passed without a single ripple of activity from Derek. There were no cryptic videos appearing on new accounts, no aggressive captions being posted under fake names, and no anonymous emails arriving in our inboxes. No recycled podcast clips surfaced, and no burner accounts attempted to make contact with us through any platform. For the first time in what felt like forever, our daily lives slowed down to a normal pace. We weren't constantly checking our phones for notifications, weren't monitoring our email inboxes for suspicious messages, and weren't asking friends to keep us updated about Derek's latest online activities. Our phones stayed peaceful and quiet, free from the anxiety-inducing alerts that had become such a regular part of our routine. During this period of calm, we were invited to attend the wedding of one of Maya's cousins. The ceremony was held outdoors at a beautiful small vineyard just outside the city, and the weather was absolutely perfect for an outdoor celebration. The entire atmosphere of the event was relaxed and joyful, exactly what a wedding should feel like. Throughout the evening, several relatives I hadn't spoken to in quite a while made a point of coming over to talk with us. These weren't dramatic conversations or lengthy explanations of where they stood on the recent family conflicts. Instead, they offered quick, quiet apologies for staying silent when they knew they should have spoken up earlier. What struck me most about these interactions was that no one tried to explain Derek's behavior or make excuses for what had happened. No one attempted to fix the situation or broker some kind of reconciliation between us. They simply acknowledged their own silence during Derek's harassment campaign and took ownership of their decision not to intervene when they could have. Derek wasn't invited to the wedding, and for most of the evening, no one brought him up in conversation at all. The celebration proceeded without any tension or drama, and people seemed to genuinely enjoy themselves without worrying about someone creating a scene or making inappropriate comments. Later in the evening, someone mentioned almost casually in passing that Derek had apparently moved out of state entirely. No specific details were provided about where he had gone or why he had left, just a simple acknowledgement that he was no longer living in the area. The news was delivered matter-of-factly, without any particular emotion or emphasis. Our lawyer confirmed what we had suspected about Derek's complete disappearance from all online platforms. Derek's new podcast account had been permanently suspended by the hosting service, not just for the rebranded episodes he had uploaded, but for multiple violations across his entire original podcast series as well. The platform had conducted a comprehensive review and flagged his content under their harassment policy guidelines. The permanent suspension meant that there was nothing left for Derek to re-upload or reframe on that particular platform. Every path he had been using to push his narrative and continue his harassment campaign had been systematically shut down by content moderators. His ability to reach audiences through podcast content had been completely eliminated. Around this time, Maya began using her own social media platform in a different way that felt empowering and constructive. She started writing thoughtful short posts about family dynamics, focusing on topics like how toxic behavior often hides behind tradition and how silence from bystanders allows harmful patterns to grow and flourish. Maya was careful not to name specific people or point fingers at particular family members in her posts. She didn't need to link her content directly to what had happened with Derek, because people who knew our situation could understand the broader principles she was discussing. Her posts were about recognizing and addressing harmful dynamics in general, rather than relitigating our specific conflict. The response to Maya's post was overwhelmingly positive. She received quiet thank you messages from people who appreciated her insights, private support from friends and family members, and a few brave comments from others who were navigating their own complicated family situations. Her content was helping people think more critically about toxic behavior and their own responses to it. For me, therapy had initially been just a place to unpack the recent stress and trauma from Derek's harassment campaign. However, over time, the sessions evolved into something much deeper and more valuable. I began to recognize patterns from years earlier in my life, identifying other people who had used similar language and tactics to what Derek employed. Through therapy, I started to understand how Derek's approach to undermining people wasn't unique or original. The way he framed quietness as weakness and gentleness as failure was a tactic I had encountered before from other people in different contexts. Derek had simply picked up these manipulation techniques where others had left off, using the same playbook but with his own personal twist. One afternoon, I received a notification from a podcast app that briefly made my heart skip a beat. Derek's old co-host had uploaded something new for the first time since their show had been suspended. This was the first podcast content from either of them since Derek's harassment campaign had resulted in the show being shut down entirely. I didn't listen to the entire episode because I wasn't sure I wanted to open that door again, but someone sent me a clip that was particularly relevant to our situation. In the audio segment, Derek's former co-host talked about how sometimes the biggest problem in your life isn't the external world or outside circumstances. It's the person sitting right next to you who's supposed to be your partner. Derek's co-host didn't mention Derek by name in this new solo episode, but the timing and context made it absolutely clear who he was referring to. The tone of his comments wasn't angry or vindictive. Instead, he sounded tired and relieved, like someone who had finally escaped from a draining situation that had been wearing him down for months. The fact that Derek's own podcast partner was now distancing himself from their collaboration and implicitly criticizing Derek's behavior felt like a significant validation of everything we had experienced. It confirmed that Derek's problems weren't limited to our family conflict. They extended to his professional relationships and creative partnerships as well. Out of nowhere, Derek's mother sent us an email that completely caught us off guard. Her message asked if we were open to the possibility of reconciliation with Derek at some point in the future. Not immediately, but perhaps someday when enough time had passed. The email was polite, formal, and very carefully worded, suggesting that she had thought extensively about how to approach us. I made the decision not to respond to Derek's mother's email at all. I had absolutely no interest in leaving any door open for future contact or reconciliation with Derek, regardless of how much time might pass or how much his behavior might theoretically change. The damage he had done was too extensive and deliberate for me to consider any form of renewed relationship. Maya chose to respond on behalf of both of us, but her reply was extremely brief and unambiguous. She sent back just one line: "There's nothing to rebuild. We've made our choice." Her response was polite but firm, making it clear that we had no interest in future reconciliation attempts and that our decision was final. At work, things had been steady and productive for quite some time, but that month brought an unexpected opportunity for professional growth. I was offered a small promotion that came with increased responsibility on current projects and the chance to work with several new clients who were looking for web development services. During the meeting where my boss discussed the promotion with me, he made a comment that really meant a lot to me personally. He mentioned how I had handled months of outside drama and harassment without ever letting it affect the quality of my work or my relationships with colleagues. He said that kind of steadiness and professionalism was rare, and that he had noticed and appreciated my ability to maintain focus despite difficult personal circumstances. Not long after I received the promotion, one of Maya's friends, the same one who had flagged Derek's TikTok video months earlier and warned us about the escalation of his behavior, submitted a story to a podcast journalism project she was working on. Derek's name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the story, but his harassment campaign was used as a detailed case study example. The journalism piece explored how online platforms can allow harassment to escalate systematically when content moderators and community members don't step in early enough to stop problematic behavior. Maya's friend used our experience to illustrate how a pattern of harassment can grow from small, seemingly harmless comments into a full-scale campaign of public humiliation and professional interference. The story wasn't sensationalized or designed for entertainment value. Instead, it was a thoughtful, honest examination of how harassment campaigns develop and spread across multiple platforms. The piece concluded with a warning about the dangers of bystander silence and how failing to address toxic behavior early often enables it to escalate into much more serious situations. That same week, I received a birthday message from one of Maya's cousins that really touched me deeply. The message wasn't long or elaborate, but it was incredibly meaningful. It simply said, "You showed us all what strength looks like. No speech needed." The acknowledgement that my quiet, steady response to Derek's attacks had been noticed and respected meant more to me than any dramatic confrontation could have. That weekend, Maya and I decided to take a trip to the mountains and stay in a small, remote cabin for a few days. The cabin had no cell phone signal, no Wi-Fi connection, and no digital distractions of any kind. It was exactly the kind of complete disconnection from technology and outside stress that we both needed after months of dealing with online harassment. We spent our time at the cabin cooking simple meals together, taking short hikes through the beautiful mountain trails, and enjoying long stretches of peaceful quiet without checking our phones or worrying about notifications. For the first time in many months, we barely kept track of what time it was, allowing ourselves to simply exist in the moment without external pressures. On the last night of our mountain getaway, Maya sat across from me by the wood-burning fireplace in our small cabin. She didn't bring up Derek or any of the harassment we had endured over the past months. She didn't ask me about the future or try to process everything we had been through together. Instead, she simply looked at me thoughtfully and said, "I know this whole situation wasn't fair to you, but I'm proud of how we handled it." I didn't say anything in response to Maya's comment because sometimes words aren't necessary to communicate understanding and appreciation. Instead, I simply reached across the space between our chairs and took her hand in mine. For the first time in what felt like a very long while, that simple gesture of connection felt like it was enough to express everything we both needed to communicate. 4 months passed without a single sound or sign from Derek anywhere. There were no burner social media accounts attempting to contact us, no indirect quotes or references appearing in any content we came across, and no sudden videos or mysterious messages being passed through mutual contacts. His podcast remained completely offline. His blog stayed blank and inaccessible, and the social media handles he had been using were either permanently deleted or frozen. Even people who had previously defended Derek or made excuses for his behavior had gone completely quiet about the entire situation. The silence surrounding Derek was comprehensive and seemed to extend across all the platforms and relationships he had been using to spread his harassment campaign. For the first time since the birthday party speech, the silence felt permanent rather than temporary. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived at our house that immediately caught my attention. The envelope had no return address printed anywhere on it, and the handwriting used for our address wasn't familiar to either Maya or me. Inside was a single sheet of paper that was unsigned and contained no identifying information, but the tone and content were unmistakably Derek's. The letter read like an awkward attempt at closure, filled with vague phrases that sounded like they might be apologies, but never actually said anything concrete or took responsibility for specific actions. Derek wrote about how we all have our truths, and how some wounds are caused by misunderstanding, not malice, completely avoiding any acknowledgement of his deliberate harassment campaign. There was a line in Derek's letter about hoping to find peace eventually, even if it's apart, which suggested he might finally be accepting that our relationship was permanently severed. However, the entire tone of the letter felt like an attempt to rewrite history and position himself as someone who had been misunderstood rather than someone who had engaged in systematic harassment. I didn't read the entire letter thoroughly because I recognized Derek's distinctive writing style and manipulative language patterns within the first few sentences. Instead of engaging with his attempt at communication, I put the letter back in its envelope exactly as I had found it and took it directly to the post office. I sent Derek's unopened letter back to him via certified mail, ensuring that there would be a legal record of my refusal to accept his communication. This wasn't a dramatic gesture or an emotional response. It was simply another concrete step in maintaining the distance and boundaries we had established months earlier. Our lawyer documented Derek's letter attempt as part of our ongoing harassment file, adding it to the comprehensive record we had been maintaining throughout this entire ordeal. The fact that Derek was still trying to make contact after receiving a cease and desist letter was legally significant, even if the letter itself wasn't threatening or explicitly hostile. The process of returning Derek's letter unopened felt clean and final. It was legal, emotionally healthy, and complete in a way that engaging with his attempt at manipulation would never have been. By refusing to read his words or respond to his attempt at contact, I was maintaining control over my own boundaries rather than allowing Derek to force another interaction. Maya had quietly joined an online support forum several months earlier, primarily to read other people's experiences and observe how they handled similar situations with difficult family members. For most of that time, she had simply been a silent participant, reading posts and learning from other people's stories without contributing her own experiences to the community. After Derek's letter attempt, Maya decided to post parts of our story on the support forum. She was careful not to share the entire narrative or include identifying details that could compromise our privacy. Instead, she focused on offering perspective and practical advice for people dealing with unhinged family members who refuse to respect boundaries. Maya's inbox filled with responses within just one day of posting our story excerpt. The messages weren't dramatic or seeking gossip about our situation. Instead, they were filled with genuine gratitude from people who had been struggling to find words for their own experiences until they read Maya's description of what we had been through. Many of the people who reached out to Maya said that reading about our situation had helped them understand that they weren't alone in dealing with family members who used public humiliation and systematic harassment as weapons. Her post had apparently given several people the vocabulary and framework they needed to describe their own difficult family dynamics. Maya's father called us later that week, and his conversation with us was particularly meaningful. He didn't spend time talking about Derek or relitigating what had happened during the harassment campaign. Instead, he focused on his own reflections about the entire situation and what he had learned from watching our response. Maya's father told us that looking back, he could see signs of Derek's problematic behavior much earlier than the birthday party speech. He admitted that he hadn't acted on those warning signs when he should have, and that this was something he would have to carry with him going forward. However, he also said that he was genuinely proud of how we